Hey James, I don't know what happened. I made a video on this and I had uploaded it. I can't find it. Obviously, I must have done something wrong because it didn't make it on there. I even went and looked for it in my computer, couldn't even find it. Maybe the whole thing was a dream. I don't know. But I thought I did this. Anyways, I'm making another one. This is a video. This is to your question about the why were the letters of Paul considered infallible and able to be put into the New Testament canonization of the Scriptures, whereas a letter from my pastor to a church today would not be considered such. And I don't want to get into a huge conversation and a huge discussion on the canonization of Scripture and the whole history of the New Testament, how it was compiled, who compiled it, the councils, and so on and so forth. I could probably make a whole, 5-part video series on that subject. I'm not going to do that. If you are genuinely looking for information on the history of the New Testament and the canon, I would be more than happy to send you a message that will have. There's pretty much two sources that I usually look for when looking at New Testament history. One of them is a website, not Wikipedia or anything. I do not like using Wikipedia for anything because that's just, it's user-submitted information, and obviously that would be totally prone to error. Maybe good for a quick look-up kind of thing, but I generally try to stay away from it as much as possible. One of them is a website, one of them is a book. I'd be more than happy to point you in the direction of. You could take a look at the website, hit the library, check out the book or something. If so, just drop me a message. I'll get that information to you. But to sum up your question really quickly, the early canonization of the Scripture was not an overnight process, first off. It was not an overnight process, being that it actually took place over a span of about 400 years. Through this time period, more and more writings began to develop about Christ, about his teachings, about his life, and where the church was to go from there on out, what direction the church was supposed to head in. And there was as many writings as there was opinions of people at that particular time. Finally, it got to a point to where these councils, the council was developed to say, okay, this is what is needing to be preserved as Scripture. The rest of this stuff just does not fit. So they took into account 4 criteria: authority, content, agreement, and date. The person writing the Scripture had to have some kind of authority on the subject they were writing. Whether it was personal eyewitness accounts of Jesus Christ and his teachings, or in the case of Paul, Paul was not a follower of Christ. He actually sought to persecute early Christians. He had a hand in the deaths of many of the early members of the Christian church. But he was shown Christ. I don't know how much of the Bible you know or how much you read or care to know, but Paul was basically visited by Christ after Christ's death and resurrection and asked, why are you persecuting me? Why are you persecuting my followers? And this whole experience was just a radical change for him, and he changed his entire view and began writing letters to these churches, started growing more and more and more in his teachings about Christ. And he was definitely considered to have an authority on the early Christian church writings. The next is what did I say? Authority is the first one. Authority, content. The content had to be universally used and accepted by early churches. Even before the New Testament Bible, or the Bible as we know it today, had even come to be organized, churches were already using writings, teachings, and these letters from Paul in their services, in their teachings, in their sermons. And obviously the more universally accepted through all these early churches the certain writings were, the more prone they were going to be to end up in the Scripture, and the more or less likely they were prone to any errors. The Third is agreement. The writings themselves had to have a certain agreement to them and to the other writings, which is why the Gospel of Thomas, the Acts of Philip, the Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, the so-called Gospel of Jesus aren't in these books. They had no agreement. They compared nothing to the teachings of Jesus. They contradicted the teachings of Jesus. They were thought and believed to have been written by the Jews trying to ruin the reputation of Christ shortly after his death. By throwing in some additional writings, they could poison the early church in hopes that it just wouldn't go much further than it did, by making Jesus not look like he was the person that he was, that, you know, by making him look like he was just a normal human being, you know, there was a lot of heresy that was being taught, and it needed to be squashed. So the canonization of scriptures was done, and the agreement was one of the things that was very, very, very strictly sought over, looked at, considered for the ability to be included in the scripture, the New Testament canon. The fourth was the date. Basically anything written after 180 was just thrown in garbage. It had been too long of a time period lapsed, too prone to errors because of the time period. It could have been passed down. The writers could have no longer, most of them probably weren't alive still. It was just, the timing was an issue, and anything after, anything over 100 years old was just out the door. It wasn't going to be considered. To tie all that in, why would a letter written by a pastor today to a church be considered to be in the canon? I mean, obviously it's 2,000 plus years after the fact. We're not going to go back and rewrite the Bible just to throw something, some great letter that a pastor writes today into it. Could a pastor write something infallible? Absolutely. All they need to do is write something truthful, something honest, something that does not have any errors or any fallacies in it, and they have an infallible writing. It could even be inspired by God. God could have used the pastor as a tool to write out this particular letter. It still is not going to end up in the Bible. It could end up, a great literary work, but it's too long after the fact. It doesn't have that, it's not within that time frame. It's, the pastor would not have the authority. He wasn't an eyewitness of Christ or any of his followers. He, it may have agreement, it may have content, but granted, this content is not being used in the early churches because it's too long after the fact. And the date, obviously, you can see how it wouldn't fit into that category. I hope that answers your question. I did notice that you had another video posted up asking about universalism. I think I know where you're going with this one, but before I answer, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the video. And as soon as I do, I'll get a video for that one posted up as soon as possible.